Good afternoon, all. I just want to do a quick video or Bible study. I just had to say something about these Hebrew Israelites that continually are missing the point and are in error when they say men under the new covenant are saved because they obey the 600 plus laws of Moses. Righteousness under the law of Moses and righteousness under the new covenant are two separate and distinct things. Righteousness under the law of Moses, which justifies men in the eyes of God, under the old covenant is totally different and distinct from righteousness under the new covenant, which makes men justified and righteous under the new covenant. What is the works of faith? What is the works of the new covenant? There is a law of Christ, which is different than the law of Moses. There are works under Christ, which are different than the works under the law. The works under the law are what? To obey the laws and commandments of Moses. The works under the new covenant of faith are different than the works under the old covenant. What are the works of faith? Galatians chapter 5 verse 22 says that the works of faith are, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith. So you see in verse 22 of Galatians chapter 5, those things that are designated as the works of faith. The works of faith are not the same as the works under the law. The works of faith under the law of Christ is summed up in one word, as spoken before: love thy neighbor as thyself. As stated here in verse 22, the works of faith under the law of faith is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, and faith. Meekness, temperance, against such there is no law. Interesting. Chapter 6, verse 2, it says, bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Hebrew Israelites who believe that the law is not fulfilled until Jesus returns and all the prophecies have been fulfilled, you're in for a rude awakening. Chapter 6 verse 2 says, bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. How do you fulfill the law of Christ? Is it more important to fulfill the law of Christ, or is it more important to fulfill the law of Moses? It is, under the new covenant, important to fulfill the law of Christ, because under the new covenant, only the law of Christ is in effect. Jesus fulfilled the law of Moses upon his death and began a new covenant and a new law. You can't have two opposing laws in effect at the same time. Upon Jesus' death, the old covenant law was fulfilled and a new covenant was established with new laws of Christ. In chapter 6 verse 2 it says, bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. So if you bear one another's burdens, you love your neighbor like you love yourself, you have fulfilled the law of Christ. The new covenant and the old covenant are two different things. They're not the same. And these Hebrew Israelites keep trying to put old wine into a new bottle. They keep trying to keep alive the old covenant. I mean, that makes absolutely no sense. Jesus died not to establish or maintain an old covenant, but to establish a new covenant by which men can now receive the promise of everlasting life. Jesus did not die so that men could perfect works under the old covenant. Righteousness under the new covenant supersedes the righteousness under the old covenant. The righteousness under the old covenant cannot and did not bring about everlasting life. Men that obeyed the laws of Moses did not receive the promise of everlasting life because they were not justified by faith. It is the justification under the new covenant by faith that allows men to receive the promise, whether or not they obey the laws of Moses, because the promise was based upon a covenant that was established between God and Abraham by faith. The promise of everlasting life is a promise that is given to men by faith. And why is that? Because the covenant that God established between Abraham and the promised seed of Abraham was a covenant based upon, premised upon, and established by faith, not because of what Abraham did, but because Abraham had faith in God. Abraham was a pagan, worshiping individual who lived and believed and did the works of his father, who was a pagan. However, God selected Abraham. Abraham did not select God. God did not select Abraham because Abraham did something righteous in the eyes of God. Abraham was a pagan worshiper. At the same time God selected Abraham, Abraham was a pagan. Abraham did not do anything righteous in order to deserve his selection by God. Abraham did not do any righteous works that merited his selection to be in covenant with God. It was God's divine election that he selected Abraham. Out of all the men on the planet Earth, God selected Abraham, not because Abraham was living a righteous and holy lifestyle, but because God, in his own divine purpose, selected Abraham. And the covenant was established because Abraham believed in God and did what God told him to do. The covenant God established with Abraham was based upon faith, and the promises of God to Abraham within the covenant can only be received by faith. The same faith Abraham manifested must be manifested by those covenant heirs of Abraham that came to be through the birth of Isaac and Jacob and the 12 tribes of Israel, who became known as the nation of Israel. In order to receive the promises of God in the new covenant, men must have faith in Jesus Christ. Righteousness is only established under the new covenant by faith, not by the law. The law was merely given to the promised seed of Abraham because of their unrighteous, sinful ways that they had learned while living in Egypt. The law was given so that men of Israel would know what is unrighteous and those things that displease God. The law is not the basis upon which the covenant was established. It was faith, by faith. So I was listening to these black Hebrew Israelites who are to be praised for their knowledge of God, but they have allowed the law to be a stumbling block. The law of Moses has become a stumbling block to these black Hebrew Israelites. They fail to understand that the law was only given as a schoolmaster. It is a shadow of things to come. It is not the all in all. The law is merely a school that God gave to his chosen people to get back in line and learn those things that pleases him. It is not the basis upon which men are justified to receive the promises of God. So let me go through this in Romans chapter 3 and chapter 4. I'm going to read a few scriptures here out of Romans chapter 3 and chapter 4, where the Apostle Paul is talking about the difference between the righteousness under the law of Moses and righteousness that is now required by God for his chosen people to receive the promise of everlasting life. Paul talks about the righteousness that men under the new covenant must manifest in order to receive the promise of everlasting life. Let's start. I'm going to start with Romans chapter 3, verse 21, and read each of these verses and explain what they mean. Romans chapter 3, verse 21, it says, "But now the righteousness of God without the law is manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets." Again, but now the righteousness of God. What is the righteous? What does God declare to be righteousness? But now the righteousness of God without the law is manifested. What righteousness of God is now manifested without the law? Being witnessed by the law. Oh, so the law is not the righteousness. It's merely a witness. It's merely a witness. Being witnessed by the law and the prophets. So we see in verse 21 that the law is not the righteousness of God that would justify men, but the law is merely a witness of the righteousness to come. Let's go to verse 22. Even the righteousness of God, which is by faith of Jesus Christ, unto all and upon all them that believe, for there is no difference. So verse 22 says, even the righteousness of God. So there is righteousness of God. What is that righteousness of God? Which is by faith of Jesus Christ. So the righteousness of God is having faith in Jesus Christ. Unto all and upon all them that believe, for there is no difference. So verse 22 says that faith in Jesus Christ is the righteousness of God. And there is no difference between having faith in Jesus Christ and the righteousness of God. So the righteousness of God is faith in Jesus Christ, not the law. There is no difference between the righteousness of God and having faith in Jesus Christ. Verse 23. For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. 24. Verse 24. Being justified freely by his grace. Doesn't cost you anything. Doesn't cost you tithes and offerings. You are justified freely. In Matthew, it says, freely we have received, freely give. That's what Jesus said. Not paying tithes and offerings that's taught by pimps and scam artists like Creflo Dollar, T.D. Jakes, and all these other Christians that are now collecting money tithes. Verse 24 says, you are justified freely, quote, being justified freely by his grace. It's because God wants to give something to you out of the kindness of his heart. That's what grace means, giving you something you do not deserve, you have not merited, but is being given to you freely because God desires to do so, because he's God. Being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ. So verse 24 says that you are justified because God has allowed you to have mercy and be justified. Justified by what? By the redemption that is in Jesus Christ. You see, Jesus died to redeem his people. Jesus died to redeem Israel. And verse 24 says that we are justified by the redemption that is in Jesus Christ. When Jesus died on the cross, he died to redeem Israel of their sins. The law does not redeem you. The law of Moses does not redeem you. I don't understand how these Israelites cannot read this and understand what is clearly written in the Bible. Verse 25, whom God had set forth to be a propitiation through faith in his blood, to declare his righteousness for the remission of sins that are past through the forbearance of God. Verse 25 says, whom God has set forth to be a propitiation through faith in his blood. Jesus died for a purpose, to declare his righteousness for the remission of sins that are passed through the forbearance of God. So, the sacrifice of Jesus was a declaration of righteousness for the remission of sins. Not obeying the law of Moses. Obeying the law of Moses was not a declaration of righteousness for the remission of sins. It was the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ that is a declaration of righteousness. Verse 26, to declare, I say, at this time his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of him which believeth in Jesus. So Jesus died on the cross. He was sacrificed as prophesied to declare, I say, at this time his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of him which believeth in Jesus. So Jesus was just when he was sacrificed, and he was righteous. And those that believe in him are justified and righteous. Verse 27. Where is boasting then? Is it excluded by the law? What does that mean? Where is boasting then? Is it excluded by the law? Can a man boast because he obeys the laws of Moses? No, it says nay. Verse 27 says, where is boasting then? Is it excluded by the law of works? No, but by the law of faith. You see, a man cannot boast because he declares that he keeps the laws of Moses. A man cannot boast that he is righteous because he keeps all the 600 plus laws of Moses that he wears. What do you call those trims around their shirts and stuff? Their tassels, and they don't shave their beards. They wear beards and all. They practice the laws and commandments of Moses today. You can't brag because you claim to follow all the laws of Moses today. Verse 27 says, where is boasting then? It says that men can only boast because they follow the law of faith, not the law of Moses. It's not by your works, but by your faith that you can boast. 27 says, where is boasting then? Is it excluded by the law of works? What you did, what you do? No, but by the faith, by the law of faith. You see, there is two laws, the law of Moses and the law of faith. When these Hebrew Israelites say, do you follow the law? Yes, we follow the law. We follow the law of faith. There are two laws, the law of Moses under the old covenant and the law of faith under the new covenant. As we have read, only the law of faith justifies men. Only the law of faith is righteous in the eyes of God. Verse 28, therefore we conclude. All right, now we're about to hear the judge make a judgment. We're about to hear what scripture says is the conclusion of all these matters. What the scriptures say is the judgment of the law of faith and the law of Moses in regards to men being justified and righteous under the new covenant. Verse 28 says, therefore we conclude that a man is justified by faith without the deeds of the law. How clearer can you get? I don't understand. People have these opinions that they have been indoctrinated to believe, and they will not give up those opinions, and they will not worship God in truth and spirit, even though what they believe has been contradicted by the Bible. Verse 28 says, therefore, we conclude that a man is justified by the law. No, it does not say a man is justified by the law. It says a man is what? Is justified by faith without the deeds of the law. Now, when you stand in front of God and say, God, I've obeyed all of the laws of Moses, can I enter the kingdom of heaven? I obeyed all 600 and some laws of Moses. And so it was my opinion that I was justified because I obeyed all the laws of Moses and I was righteous. Now can I enter? And God and Jesus are going to say to you, did you not know how to read. I didn't put you on a short bus. I gave you a mind that functioned perfectly on earth. And I wrote in Romans chapter 3, verse 28, clearly, not ambiguously and unclear, but I was precise when I said, therefore, we conclude that a man is justified, that is, a man is redeemed and considered righteous by faith without the deeds of the law. That means that whatever you do, whatever works you perform under the law of Moses is not going to make you justified. I mean, it can't be any more clear than that. Verse 29, is he the God of the Jews only? Is he not also of the Gentiles? Yes, of the Gentiles also. So what does this mean? Is he the God of the Jews only? Or is he also the God of the Gentiles? This says that God is not only the God of the Jews only. The Jews, you know, are those that live in the southern kingdom that followed the laws of Moses. The Jews referred to in verse 29 is referring to the Israelites that lived in the southern kingdom of Israel, the tribe of Judah, Benjamin, and Levi, who followed the laws of Moses. They were circumcised and they supposedly were righteous because they followed the laws and commandments of Moses. And the Gentiles are those 10 tribes that lived in the northern kingdom that had not been following the laws and commandments of Moses, but were living as pagan Gentiles for 800 years before Jesus was born. Scripture says in 29 that God is not only the God of the southern kingdom of Israel only, but also of the northern 10 tribes of Israel who did not follow the laws of Moses, but were sinners and lived like pagans because they were scattered throughout the world 800 years before by the Assyrians. But God allowed the tribe of Judah, Benjamin, and Levi to remain in Jerusalem and maintain their righteousness by following the laws of Moses. But God here in verse 29 is saying that he's not only the God of those that were following the laws and commandments of Moses and doing the works required under the law, but he was also the God of those Israelites that were not righteous by their works. They were not righteous by their works because they were not following the laws and commandments of Moses. But he still is the God of the 10 northern tribes of Israel, who are now referred to in verse 29 as Gentiles. Verse 30. Seeing it is one God which shall justify the circumcision by faith and uncircumcision through faith. See, verse 30 clearly says, there is one God which shall justify the circumcision by faith, those that follow the law of Moses, that live in the southern kingdom, they will be justified and deemed righteous by faith, not by following the law of Moses. It says, there is one God which shall justify the circumcision, those Israelites living in the southern kingdom that were following the laws of Moses. Those Israelites that were following the law of Moses were called the circumcision. But in verse 30, it says, those Israelites that were following the laws of Moses will be justified by faith, not by the law. And those uncircumcised Israelites living in the northern kingdom shall be justified through faith. So we see that both the northern and southern kingdom of Israel shall both be circumcised, both be justified by faith, not by the law. Verse 30 says, seeing it is one God, which shall justify the circumcision by faith and uncircumcision through faith. You see, the circumcision, the Israelites that were circumcised and the Israelites that were uncircumcised are both justified by faith, not by following the laws of Moses. Verse 31. Do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid. Yea, we establish the law. You see, the law of Moses was merely a shadow of things to come. It was merely a schoolmaster to teach the Israelites that came out of Egypt what pleases God, because they had adopted all of these pagan ways of the Egyptians, ways that were unholy, and they needed to be taught once again the ways of God, those things that please God. So God gave them the laws of Moses, to teach them what pleases God and to develop customs and traditions that were not like what they had learned from the Egyptians. So the law was good because it allowed Israel to understand what was sin and to avoid doing those things that were sinful in the eyes of God. And if you did not follow the law, you were not pleasing to God. So the law was a debt that had to be paid. The law was a debt, D-E-B-T. It was something that was not pleasing to God. If Israelites had not been living sinful, God would not have had to send them to school. If Israel was living holy, God would not have had to give them the law. But they became ignorant and sinful, so God had to send them to school to get some manners once they left Egypt. And that was the law. That was the purpose of the law, to let them know what sin was and what was unpleasing to God. The law was not the covenant. The law was not how God established his covenant. The covenant was established between God and Abraham by faith. A promise was made, and Abraham had belief and faith. And that was the basis upon which the covenant was made. The law is merely some terms of the covenant that God gave to Moses for Israel to follow, to get back in line with what pleases him. All right, let's go on. Verse 31 says that, do we then void the law through faith? Did we go to school for nothing? No. God forbid. Yea, we established the law. Faith supersedes the law. Faith establishes the law. Faith supersedes the law. Faith is greater than the law. The law was merely the tools by which Israel was to get back in line with God and have faith in who their God was. Chapter 4, verse 1. What shall we say then? That Abraham, our father, as pertaining to the flesh, had found. What did Abraham find? What was the basis upon which the covenant was established with God? What did Abraham, our father, find? Verse 2. For if Abraham were justified by works, he had whereof to glory, but not before God. Verse 2 says, for what if Abraham were justified by works? He had whereof to glory, but not before God. Abraham was not justified by his works, as I stated before. Abraham was a pagan worshiper. He was living sinful and unholy at the time God selected him. So Abraham was selected by God not because of his works. He was not justified because of his works. He was not justified and selected by God because he was righteous and doing those things that were pleasant in the eyes of God. Abraham was not selected by God at the time God decided to make a covenant with him. He was not justified or merited his selection because of his works. So Abraham cannot glory in his works. He cannot say, oh, look at me. I was so holy and righteous in the eyes of God that God chose me. No, he was just like all the other pagan worshipers. He was not justified by his works before God. Verse 3. For what said the scripture? Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. So you see, Abraham was not considered righteous in the eyes of God because of his works. Abraham was considered righteous in the eyes of God because he believed God. He had faith. It was faith that established the covenant, not works. It was not by works that the covenant was established between God and Abraham. It was because of Abraham's faith, the same type of faith that must be manifested by those in the new covenant. Verse 4. Now to him that worketh is the reward, not reckoned of grace, but of debt. Now, verse 4. Now to him that worketh is the reward, not reckoned of grace, but of debt. So what that says is that those that live under the law of Moses, they are under a debt. They owe a debt to God, not to do those things that God said for them not to do. The law is merely a declarations of God made to his chosen people concerning those things they should not do and those things they should do in order to please God. So it is a debt. It is not something that will reward them with righteousness, but to keep them from being unrighteous. The law is a declaration and knowledge of sin. It is something that allows the chosen people of God to know what displeases God. It is not something that will make you righteous in the eyes of God. Verse 4 says, quote, now to him that worketh, that obey the law of Moses, is the reward not reckoned. See, the reward is not given to you because of what you do. But the reward is given to those under the new covenant by grace, by the mercy of God, because God wants to give it to you, not because of what you did, but it's because it is by the will and mercy of God that you receive the promise. Not because you deserve it, because of what you did, but because of his grace. Verse 5. But to him that worketh not, but believeth on him that justifieth the ungodly, his faith is counted for righteousness. There it is. There's the rule right there. That is the clear declaration of the rule. Let's read 4 and 5 again together. Now, verse 4. Now to him that worketh is the reward not reckoned of grace, but of debt. Verse 5. But to him that worketh not, but believeth on him that justifieth the ungodly, his faith is counted for righteousness. So you see, verse 5 clearly says, those that are not circumcised and are not following the law of Moses are justified because they believe on him that justified the ungodly. Who justified the ungodly? Jesus and God. And it is his faith that is counted for righteousness. It is faith that's counted for righteousness, not your works under the law. It is not your obedience to the laws and commandments of Moses that is counted for righteousness, but it is your belief on him. Who is the him? Jesus. Jesus is the one that God counted as righteous. As we stated before, belief in Jesus and the righteousness of God are both the same. There is no difference. Your belief in Jesus is what justifies you as righteous. It is your faith in Jesus that is counted for righteousness, not the law. Clearly. Verse 5 again. But to him that worketh not, to him that worketh not, to him that does not follow the law of Moses, but believeth on him that justifieth the ungodly. Who are the ungodly? The ungodly are those not following the laws of Moses. Those that do not follow the law of Moses, faith is counted for righteousness. So if you are the uncircumcised Israelites living in the northern kingdom who were conquered by the Assyrians 800 years before Jesus was born, and your family have taught you to follow the laws and commandments, follow the customs and traditions of pagans, like African Americans who live here in America, who follow the pagan traditions and customs of Easter and Christmas and same-sex marriage and men marrying men and women marrying women and people getting wearing their pants halfway down their pants and taking dope and listening to rap music and doing all the things that these pagan Europeans do. Those are the people being spoken of here as the ungodly. Their faith is counted for righteousness, not their works, not their obedience to the laws and commandments of Moses. It is not those black Hebrew Israelites who go around saying that they follow all the laws, commandments of Moses that make them righteous and justified. Verse 5 needs to be looked at and recognized for what it says. It says, but to him that worketh not, those that do not follow the law and commandments of Moses, to him that worketh not. It is not your works. To him that worketh not, but rather believe on him that justified. To them that believe on him that justified, and him that justified is Jesus Christ, who died to redeem Israel of all of their sins. To him that believeth on him that justifieth the ungodly. You see, Jesus died to justify not the Jews that were living in the southern kingdom that were following the laws of Moses, but Jesus died not only for those hypocrites, but Jesus died for the 10 tribes of Israel that were scattered throughout the northern kingdom that were living ungodly, following the customs and traditions of pagans. Like I said before, just like African Americans who are scattered throughout the world, here in America, living like ungodly pagan Europeans, following the practices of Christmas, Easter, Sunday worship, homosexual lifestyles, and every other type of perverted abomination known to man. Jesus died for those ungodly people who have faith in him, not the law of Moses, but have faith in him. They're the ones whose faith is counted for righteousness. I mean, it's stated right there clearly in verse 5. But to him that worketh not those that say they follow the laws and commandments of Moses and do everything right, but to him that believeth on him that justified the ungodly. His faith, not his practice of the law or his works, but his faith is counted for righteousness, just like Abraham's faith was counted for righteousness. It was not Abraham's works or those things that were done by Abraham that were righteous in the eyes of God, or it was not Abraham's works, but Abraham's faith that established the covenant God made with Abraham and the promised seed of Abraham. Verse 6, even as David also describeth the blessings of the man unto whom God imputed righteousness without works, saying, blessed are they whose iniquities are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Verse 8, blessed is the man to whom the Lord will not impute sin. Yes, see, Abraham was in sin, but God did not impute sin to him. Abraham did not merit his selection by God. God selected him because he is God. And God will have mercy on those who he will have mercy, not because of what they did, because of their works, because if it was because of their works, it would not be mercy. You see, mercy and works and merit are the antithesis. They're just the opposite. If you merit something, it's because of what you did. If you're unworthy, it's because of grace. Verse 8 said, blessed is the man to whom the Lord will not impute sin. Blessed is the man whom God will have mercy on and have grace regardless of his sin. Abraham was selected by God even though he was living in sin. Jesus died to redeem the ungodly Israelites that were living in the northern kingdom, following the customs and traditions of pagans, and his righteousness is also available to African Americans living in America who are living as pagans and unrighteous men and women, regardless of their works. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord will not impute sin. So you see, you are now eligible as a covenant heir of Abraham to receive the promises of God, the promise of everlasting life, even though you are now in a state of captivity living in sin. That blessing is now available because of the perfect flesh and blood sacrifice of Jesus, who died to redeem his people. George Best, the world's best, George Best. Thank you for joining us, George Best. Clifford Tyson, Mike Tyson's brother. Thank you for joining us, Mike. Tamiko Howard. Thank you, beautiful, for joining us today. I hope y'all get something out of this. Share it with your friends. Now, where did I leave off? Now, we're in Romans chapter 4. Yeah, we're down to verse 6. Even as David also described the blessedness of man unto whom God imputed righteousness without works. God imputed righteousness without works. God considered a man to be righteous, not because of what he did, or that he was merited, or deserving, or worthy, but God nevertheless did not consider him unrighteous. Verse 7, saying, blessed are they whose iniquities are forgiven and whose sins are forgiven. Yes. Verse 8. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord will not impute sin. You see, it said the same thing 3 different ways. From verse 6, 7, and 8, it said the same thing 3 different ways. You're not blessed because you are some type of deserving holy man. You are blessed because you are born from the promised seed of Abraham. You are blessed because you have been chosen by God as one of his covenant heirs. Neither Esau nor Jacob did anything wrong to deserve to be selected by God as the promised seed of Abraham. In Romans chapter 9, God stated that before the boys were born, God had chose Jacob to be the promised seed. Not because Jacob did anything wrong or right, because neither of the boys had been born to do anything wrong or right, evil or good. Jacob was born as the promised seed of Abraham. Jacob was selected by God before he was born to be the promised seed of Abraham. It was not because of Jacob's works, but because it was God's divine election. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord will not impute sin. Verse 9, cometh this blessedness then upon the circumcision only, or upon the uncircumcised also? For we say that faith was reckoned to Abraham for righteousness. You see, Abraham was considered righteous, not because of what Abraham did, not because of Abraham's works. As I stated before, Abraham was father was a pagan worshiper, and Abraham was living and believing and doing those things his father did, which were unrighteous. But Abraham was reckoned righteous by God despite Abraham's works. Verse 9, cometh this blessedness then upon the circumcision only? What does that mean? Cometh this blessedness then upon the circumcision only? He's talking about the circumcision. Referred to here is the southern kingdom of Israel, those Israelites living in the southern kingdom of Israel, the tribes of Benjamin, Levi, and Judah that were following the laws and commandments of Moses. When he says that cometh this blessedness, this righteousness, this justification, then upon the circumcision only, he's talking about those Israelites that were living in the southern kingdom of Israel, following the laws and commandments of Moses, and followed the law of circumcision. Continuing to quote, or upon the uncircumcision also. Who are these uncircumcision? Also, it is the 10 tribes of Israel living in the northern kingdom that were living like pagans. They were considered uncircumcised because they did not follow the laws and commandments of Moses concerning the law of circumcision. They were living like pagans. So they were called the uncircumcision. So the text here says that is the blessedness of the new covenant for the circumcision only, those Israelites living in the southern kingdom following the laws and commandments of Moses, or is it also for those uncircumcised Israelites who are undeserving, because they are just like these Negroes here in America, who are no different than the pagan Europeans they have been in captivity to for the last 400 years. Continuing on, quote, for we say that faith was reckoned to Abraham for righteousness. Faith was reckoned to Abraham for righteousness, not the works of Abraham, not because Abraham was living a righteous life. Abraham was reckoned to God because of his belief, because he had faith in believing in God, not because of what he did, not because of what he worked, but because of his works. So you Hebrew Israelites who talk about, oh, we're saved by following the laws and commandments of Moses. Come on now. People can't be that naive and undiscerning. Verse 10, how was it then reckoned when he was in circumcision? How was Abraham reckoned when Abraham was selected by God? Was Abraham following the laws and commandments of Moses when he was considered righteous by God? Was Abraham following the laws and commandments of Moses when he was reckoned to be righteous by God? Verse 10 says, how was it then reckoned when he was in circumcision or in uncircumcision? You see, Abraham was uncircumcised. Abraham was not following the laws and commandments of Moses. Abraham was not following the law of circumcision when he was considered righteous by God. Abraham was not selected by God because of his works or because he was following any laws of God at the time. How was it then reckoned when he, Abraham, was in circumcision? Of course not. Abraham had not been commanded by God to circumcise himself and all the male children at the time the covenant was made. Abraham was considered faithful and righteous before the commandment that he circumcise himself and his children, the male children, 8 days after they're born. Abraham was considered righteous by God before God commanded Abraham to circumcise his children, his male children, and himself. Abraham was uncircumcised when God made his covenant. Verse 10, how was it then reckoned? How was Abraham's righteousness reckoned? Was it in circumcision? Was it when he was circumcised or when he was uncircumcised? So you Hebrew Israelites say, well, you got to be circumcised in order to be righteous by God. Was Abraham circumcised when he was considered righteous by God? Was Abraham considered righteous when he was Abraham considered righteous by God because he was circumcised? Abraham was not circumcised when he was considered righteous by God. Abraham was considered righteous by God because Abraham had faith. Abraham had displayed and manifested faith in God. That was why Abraham was considered righteous by God. That was why God made his covenant with Abraham. It was by faith, because of Abraham's faith, not because of something Abraham did. It was not because Abraham obeyed God's commandment to be circumcised. It was not because Abraham obeyed God's commandment to circumcise himself and his children 8 days after they are born. It was not because of Abraham's works that he was considered righteous in the eyes of God. It was because Abraham was told something by God and Abraham believed God. Abraham had faith in what he was told by God. Abraham believed in his heart. He believed in his heart. That means he had faith in what God said and that God would come through with his promise. He believed to the point he was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac. And God said, no, you believe, you have faith. And because of your faith, I'm going to make a covenant with you because of your belief in me. That was the basis, the premise that established God's covenant. What came first, the chicken or the egg? It was the chicken, because there would be no egg without the chicken. What came first, faith or the law or the works of Abraham? It was faith that came first. Without faith, Abraham would not have did the works. You see, it is your belief that your works are predicated upon. It is your belief, your faith, your belief that must be obtained first. And after you have a belief, then Your behavior follows behind your belief. You don't just go out and do something without first thinking about it. You must believe before you perform a work. It was Abraham's faith in God that made him righteous in the eyes of God, not his works. Verse 10 says, how was it then reckoned when he was circumcised or in uncircumcision? What does that mean? I hope you understand by now. Abraham was considered righteous by God before he was circumcised. It was not in his circumcision, but uncircumcision state. Uncircumcised state. Abraham was not circumcised at the point in time that God considered him righteous. Continuing on, not in circumcision, but in uncircumcision. That's right. That's what I've been talking about. Hebrew Israelites, you're not righteous in the eyes of God because you follow the laws and commandments of Moses. You're not righteous because you wear tassels and don't shave your beards and do all these other things that God commanded to be done when your forefathers came out of Egypt living and acting like pagans. Verse 11, and he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith, which he had yet being uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all them that believe, though they be not circumcised, that righteousness might be imputed unto them also. That says a lot. Did y'all hear that? That says a lot. And he received the sign of circumcision. You see, circumcision was merely a sign. The law, what you call the law of Moses. And he received the sign of circumcision. Circumcision was merely a sign. It was not righteousness. It was a sign of righteousness. It was a shadow of things to come. And Abraham received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith. You see, circumcision is not righteous. It's merely a sign, a symbol, a brand name that signifies the righteousness of faith. You see, faith supersedes the circumcision. Faith supersedes the law. The law is merely a shadow of things to come. The law is merely a rug that faith walks upon. You see, circumcision and the law of Moses is merely a rug or a symbol of something greater. Circumcision, as the scripture says here in verse 11, is a seal of the righteousness of the faith. You see, faith is greater than circumcision or the law of Moses, which he had yet being uncircumcised. You see, like I said before, Abraham was considered faithful. Abraham was considered righteous by God before he was circumcised, because it says here clearly, and he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith, which he had yet being uncircumcised. Which he had yet being uncircumcised. He had the righteousness of God, the seal of the righteousness of God. Abraham had the seal of the righteousness of God before he was circumcised. A seal of righteousness of the faith which he had yet being uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all them that believe, though they be not circumcised. Now, who are those that might be not circumcised? Who is God talking about? Abraham being the father of all of them that believe, though they be not circumcised. He's talking about the 10 tribes of Israel that were living in the northern kingdom as pagans for 800 years before Jesus was born. There were Israelites living as pagans in the northern kingdom of Israel, just like African Americans here over in America have been living here for the last 400, 500 years as pagans, following the customs and traditions of their pagan captives. But they also are the promised seed of Abraham. And Abraham is the father of you African Americans that believe. Even though you're not circumcised, you're not following the laws and commandments of Moses, which is not required because you're under a new covenant, a covenant based upon faith. And you are entitled to be considered righteous by God because of your belief and your faith in Jesus Christ. Your righteousness, as verse 11 says, can be imputed because of your faith. Verse 12. And the father of circumcision to them who are not of the circumcision only, but who also walk in the steps of the faith of our father Abraham, which he had being yet uncircumcised. See, there it is again. And the father of circumcision, you can, in America, can be imputed righteous in the eyes of God because of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, who redeemed you from your sins. Verse 12 says, and the father of circumcision to them who are not of the circumcision only. You see, Abraham made it possible for you to be considered righteous in the eyes of God because it is by faith that righteousness is imputed, not by obeying the laws and commandments of Moses. Verse 12 says, and the father of circumcision. See, Abraham was the father of circumcision. He was the first man. He was the progenitor, the father, the godfather, the first man to implement the law of circumcision. Abraham was the progenitor, the father, the godfather, the first man to implement God's command of circumcision. However, circumcision was only a seal, a symbol of his righteousness. It was not the righteousness itself, as these Hebrew Israelites try and say today. The godfather of circumcision, Abraham, the man to first implement and obey God's commandment that male children be circumcised, was considered righteous by God before the seal of circumcision was used to identify his faithfulness. You see, circumcision is merely a sign, a symbol, a brand name that identifies the man as being one of the promised seed of Abraham, who believes in God, the God of Abraham, who has faith. It is merely a sign, a symbol of faithfulness to the one and only God of Abraham. That's what it is. It's merely a sign, a symbol. It's symbolic of your faithfulness in the God of Abraham. It is not faith itself. Just circumcising somebody does not make you righteous in the eyes of God. It's merely a symbol of your faithfulness. Verse 12 says, and the father of circumcision to them who are not of the circumcision only. You see, Abraham was the father of circumcision to them who are not of the circumcision only. See, those people that follow the law and commandments of Moses, Abraham is their father also. The southern kingdom of Israel, the tribes of Benjamin, Judah, and Levi, who follow the laws and commandments of Moses and are considered the circumcision, Abraham is their father. But also, he is also the father of the 10 tribes of Israel that are scattered throughout the world, that do not follow the laws and commandments of Moses and live like pagans. You see, Abraham is the father of the Jews living in the southern kingdom of Israel, and also of the Gentile Israelites living like pagans in the northern kingdom of Israel, who did not follow the laws and commandments of Moses. Verse 12 again, and the father of circumcision to them who are not of the circumcision only, but who also walk in the steps of the faith of our father Abraham, which he had being yet uncircumcised. So see, Abraham is the father not only of those Israelites who follow the law and commandments of Moses regarding circumcision, but also of those Israelites who do not follow the law of circumcision, but follow the law of faith. You see, Abraham is the father of faith. And as the father of faith, both the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel must follow the law of faith in order to be righteous in the eyes of God. Both the northern and southern kingdom of Israel, and you Negroes here in America, must follow the law of faith in order to be righteous in the eyes of God, because Abraham is the father of righteousness, the father of the covenant based upon faith. The covenant is not based upon the law of Moses. Abraham is the father of faith. The law of Moses did not exist at the time the covenant was established. Abraham is not the father of the law of Moses. The only law that Abraham is the father of was the law of circumcision. And that law of works, it is a law of works. Remember that. The law of circumcision is a law of works. It is a work, something that God commanded for Abraham to do. So that is a work that God commanded Abraham to do. But that work, that commandment for Abraham to circumcise himself and his children, the male children born 8 days after, that work of circumcision is not something that established righteousness. That work that Abraham was commanded to do was not something that he did and made him righteous in the eyes of God. It was faith that was exercised by Abraham before God commanded Abraham to perform that work. It was faith that established Abraham's righteousness in the eyes of God. And it is faith that must be exercised under the new covenant by you Negroes in America and all the other promised seed of Abraham scattered throughout the world in order to receive the promises of God. Abraham was given the promises of God based upon faith, not based upon Abraham's works. Abraham was not promised the promises of God because he circumcised his male children. God did not say, oh, because you obeyed my commandment to circumcise your male children, now I'm going to make some promises to you. No, that is not what happened. God did not promise anything to Abraham because he circumcised his male child. God's promises were based on faith, not works. And God's promises are not based on the law of Moses. Just like God's promise to Abraham and righteousness of Abraham was not based upon Abraham's decision in obedience to circumcise his children. Abraham's obedience to do the work that God commanded him to circumcise his child, his male children, was not the work that established the covenant and the law of Moses. The works God commanded for Israel to perform. The works God commanded Israel to perform under the law of Moses is not the basis upon which men under the new covenant receive the promises of God. The promises of God under the new covenant are given to men who have faith. The new covenant promise of everlasting life is by grace. Just like God's covenant with Abraham was by grace. God made a covenant with Abraham based upon grace because he wanted to, because it was his mercy. And God's promises under the new covenant are based upon God's grace, not your works. Abraham did not do anything. Abraham did not merit God's selection of him as a covenant heir or a man that he would make a covenant with. and God's promises under the new covenant are not based upon the works of Israel. It is not based upon an old covenant commandment to perform works. And you cannot force that illogical reasoning upon God. It is not written in the Bible. All right, where were we? We're here on in chapter 4, verse 12, where it says, "And the father of circumcision to them who are not of the circumcision only," not of the circumcision only. So he's a father of to those that are not of the circumcision. Who are those? Like I said before, the other 10 tribes of Israel, scattered throughout the world, living like pagans, but who also walk in the steps of faith of our father Abraham, which he had being yet uncircumcised. So those Negroes in America and throughout the world that walk in the faith of our father Abraham, they're considered righteous. Verse 13, "For the promise that he should be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith." All right, people, all you Negro, black Hebrew Israelites, I want you, if one of y'all hear this, I want you to reconcile this with your belief and practice about you cannot be saved unless you follow the laws and commandments of Moses. How do you reconcile verse 13, Romans chapter 4, verse 13, with your belief and misguided belief that you got to follow the laws, commandments of Moses in order to be saved? Clearly, chapter 4, verse 13 of Romans says, "For the promise," what promise? The promise God made to Abraham, and the promise in the new covenant of everlasting life. For the promise that he should be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed. Who is the seed? The seed is the promised seed of Abraham. Only those born from the promised seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, known as the 12 tribes of Israel today. It said seed for a reason, because he wants to identify and make it clear the people to whom this message is being sent to. That he should be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law. It is, the promise was not to Abraham or Abraham's promised seed through the law. The promise was not to Abraham or his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. All right, that should close the case. What else can you say? For the promise of the new covenant, the promise of the old covenant, the promise of everlasting life in the new covenant, made to those heirs. It was not through the law. The promise was not made through the law of Moses, but through the righteousness of faith. It was through the righteousness of faith. The righteousness under the law has no effect. the righteousness of the law of Moses has been superseded and is of no effect regarding the righteousness of faith. It is the righteousness of faith that saves men, not the law. You're not saved by the law. You're saved by faith. Verse 13 says, for the promise of what? The promise of the Holy Spirit, the promise of everlasting life, that he should be heir of the world, was not to Abraham or his seed through the law. The promise God made to Abraham and the promised seed of Abraham was not made by the law of Moses, but the righteousness of faith. You see, the promises of God that were made to Abraham and the promised seed of Abraham are obtained by the righteousness of faith, not by the righteousness of the law. You see, as I stated before, Abraham was considered righteous by God before he was circumcised. Before the law was established, Abraham was considered righteous by God because of Abraham's faith. Abraham was considered righteous by God because of his faith. Before God gave Abraham the law of circumcision, and before Abraham obeyed God's commandment to circumcise his male children, Abraham was already considered righteous by God because of his faith. You see, Abraham had already demonstrated his faith in God when he attempted to sacrifice his child Isaac, and God said, stop, no, don't do that. I understand, you understand, you believe in me and that you are faithful. You indeed, Abraham, have faith. You see, Abraham was considered righteous by God before Abraham was even given any law. Abraham was considered righteous by God before Abraham was given the law of circumcision. You see, the law of circumcision was merely a symbol. It is merely symbolic of Abraham's prior exhibition of faith. Verse 13 says, for the promise that he should be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. You see, Hebrew Israelites, don't let the law be a stumbling block and knock you right into hell. Don't let the law of Moses blind you to what is clearly written and expressed and given to you in the scripture. Verse 14, for if they which are of the law be heirs, faith is made void, and the promise made of none effect. What does that mean? Mean what it says. For if they which are of the law be heirs, faith is made void. If the law is what the covenant is based upon, then Abraham's faith is of no effect. Was Abraham's righteousness considered, was Abraham considered righteous because he circumcised his male children? No, Abraham was not considered righteous because he circumcised Ishmael and all the male children in his camp, in his family. Abraham was considered righteous before God gave him the commandment to circumcise his male children. Otherwise, Abraham's faith previously demonstrated before God gave him the commandment to circumcise his children would be of no effect. If the covenant was based upon Abraham's willingness to obey God's commandment to circumcise Ishmael and the male children, then the covenant would have been based on the law, and Abraham's previously demonstrated faith to sacrifice Isaac would have no effect. It would mean nothing to the covenant. But as we know, it was Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac. It was Abraham's faith to believe God that was what God was looking for. It was God was looking for Abraham's willingness and faith and belief in him to do what he said. It was faith that made the covenant valid, not the law of circumcision, nor the law of Moses. For if they which are of the law be heirs, faith is made void, and the promise made of no effect. You see, the promise God made was based upon faith. Abraham believed God, and the promise was based upon Abraham's belief, not the subsequent act of circumcision that God commanded Abraham. See, the act of circumcision was merely a symbol that recognizes the faith of Abraham. Verse 14, for if they which are of the law be heirs, faith is made void, and the promise made of no effect. Verse 15, because the law worketh wrath. You see, the law cannot save you. The law is merely given to Israel to let Israel know what is not pleasing to God. See, the law is a do not do this. If you do it, you get. If you do not obey the law, you are punished. You are not saved. You are punished. The law is given for the specific purpose of allowing Israel to know what God does not like. But the law worketh wrath, for where no law is, there is no transgression. If Israel was not unholy, God wouldn't have given them the law. Therefore, it is of faith that it might be by grace. You see, it is by grace and faith, to the end the promise might be sure to all the seed, not to that only which is of the law, but to that also which is of the faith of Abraham, which is the father of us all. You see, it is by grace that the promise might be sure to all the seed. You see, and that shows that the promise is only for the promised seed of Abraham. It says clearly, therefore it is of faith that it might be by grace, to the end the promise might be sure to all the seed. The promise might be sure to all the seed. The promise might be sure to all the world, to all mankind. No, it says that the promise might be sure to all the seed. And we know the seed here refers to the promised seed of Abraham. Those born from the biological lineage of the promised seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's what the word seed means. It does not mean the entire world. Seed, not to that only which is of the law, that not to that only which is of the law. Who is only of the law? The southern kingdom of Israel, the tribes of Benjamin, Jacob, and Judah and Levi. The southern kingdom of Israel, not only to the southern kingdom of Israel, not to that only which is of the law, not only to those that follow the law and commandments of Moses, but to that also which is of the faith of Abraham, which is the father of us all. Those that live in the northern kingdom that do not follow the law and commandments of Moses, but have faith in Jesus under the new covenant. Yes. Verse 17, as it is written, I have made thee a father of many nations. Those in the northern kingdom also. Before him whom he believed, even God, who quickened the dead and called it those things which be not as though they were. All right, my battery getting low, y'all, so I better hurry up. Let me see if there's anything here that I want to get in before my battery run out. But I think y'all get the point. Black Hebrew, particularly Black Hebrew Israelites, who have been deceived and just ran into the side of a barn when it comes to understanding what is required to be saved under the new covenant. The law did not save you. Paul told y'all, did I perform all these miracles by the law? Were y'all saved by the law? If the law could save, then Jesus was unnecessary. Jesus did not die so that you all could obey the law. God gave y'all the law already before Jesus came. God gave y'all the law from Moses. God gave the law to Moses and told y'all to live according to the law. And Jesus was not born and die so y'all could continue to follow the law. That makes absolutely no sense. God did not justify you under the law, as I just stated in Romans chapter 3 and chapter 4. God, you were not justified by the law. The covenant of God was not based upon, premised upon, or established upon the law of circumcision or the law of Moses, which did not exist at the time the covenant was made. The promises of God and the covenant of God was based upon the faith of Abraham. Abraham was considered righteous by God by faith, a faith that was demonstrated by Abraham before God gave Abraham the commandment to circumcise the male children 8 days after they're born. The law, the covenant, and the promises and the righteousness of Abraham was established before any commandment of God concerning circumcision, the law of circumcision. You see, these Israelites, I mean, come on, man. Y'all I'm put y'all on the short bus because y'all just seem to have some kind of mental deficiency. Oh, You got to follow the laws and commandments of God. You got to follow the laws and commandments of Moses. They try and say that the laws and commandments of God, of Moses, are the laws and commandments of God, which are equivalent to the law of faith. The law of faith supersedes the law of Moses. Oh, you got to follow the law of Moses. You see, God gave Abraham the law of circumcision. And it is the law of circumcision. I had some guy talking about the covenant is the law of circumcision. How crazy, how delusional. The Bible clearly says the law of circumcision is merely a symbol, a symbolic representation of the faith. The law of Moses. Some of these Hebrew Israelites say, oh, Abraham was the father of the law. We got to follow the law of Moses. Abraham was the father of the law. Yes, fool. He was the father, the progenitor of the law of circumcision. And what does that mean? He was merely following God's commandment to circumcise the male children. Why? As a symbol of their faith. It was a symbol only of their faith. It was not the basis or the consideration given to establish the covenant. The consideration given to establish the contract, the covenant God made with Abraham, was faith given by Abraham. The consideration given by Abraham to God to establish the contract, the covenant, was faith. The contract was already established between God and Abraham when God commanded Abraham to circumcise the children, the male children. God's commandment for Abraham to circumcise the male children and Abraham's obedience to circumcise his male children. Abraham's obedience to circumcise his male children was not consideration of Abraham concerning a establishment of a contract. The consideration given by Abraham was not his obedience to God to circumcise his male children that established the covenant. That was not the consideration Abraham gave to God to establish the covenant. The consideration given by Abraham to God to establish the contract, the covenant, was his faith in believing that God would do what he said he would do. Abraham's faith in sacrificing, his will to sacrifice his child Isaac, was the consideration considered by God as substantial that established the covenant. All right, y'all. I hope y'all got something out of this. This was an extemporaneous presentation. I just had to give it after I sat here and listened at this fool. I keep calling people fool, but listen at this man on television talking about you got to follow the law and commandments of Moses. Righteousness is established under the law. There's no righteousness established under the law. I mean, clearly, the Bible clearly says righteousness. The righteousness of Abraham was established by faith, and the righteousness that is considered by God under the new covenant must be by faith, not by the law. All right, y'all. I'll talk to y'all later. Y'all take care. Read your Bible while you're home. You ain't got nothing else to do. Find everlasting life. As you can see, everlasting life got to be a whole lot better than what y'all living today. All right.
God bless.
The covenant God made with Abraham in the book of Genesis, and the new covenant God made with the nation of Israel in Jeremiah 31:31 and Hebrews 8:8 is based upon faith, not circumcision, and the law of Moses. The covenant God made with Abraham in the book of Genesis, and the new covenant God made with the nation of Israel in Jeremiah 31:31 and Hebrews 8:8 is based upon faith, not circumcision, and the law of Moses.